Hello and welcome to The Impact. I'm Mike McClanahan. This fall, Washington voters will decide who will be in charge of state government, which translates into who will be in charge of making decisions about public forests, about the state-regulated insurance market, and about schools. Voters will also decide the fate of some of the major state programs and laws enacted in recent years through a suite of initiatives on the ballot. This is the first in a series of election-focused interviews we're lining up now through the first week of November. Tonight is the nonpartisan office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. The incumbent, Chris Reykdal, has held the position since 2017. Before that, he was a state representative. He's also a former high school history teacher. His opponent, David Olson, has served on the Peninsula School Board since 2013. He is a retired naval officer and was a Pierce County Charter Review Commissioner in 2016. One of them will chart the course for K-12 education for 1.1 million public school students for the next 4 years. You'll hear from both candidates tonight, starting with the incumbent. Joining me now is Chris Reykdal. Welcome in. Thank you for your time today. If you could just give us your top priorities for the state's public education system if voters send you to this office in November.
We've got 1 million amazing kids out there learning and the best educators in the country, but we've got to fund. So number one for me is always getting back to full funding. We were getting close before the pandemic, and then we've lost a lot of ground in funding per student, especially adjusted for inflation. So I'll build that coalition again. Number two, we're really focused on student mental health and behavioral health. So there are investments that we get to make there, but there's also programming that we're deploying. And we're really taking on the question of cell phone use, but not just cell phones, but teaching students more holistically around the impact of social media on their anxiety and their sense of isolation. So it's much bigger than just cell phones. And then third, I'm very upfront about the risk of our schools becoming privatized. It matters that we all work hard to keep our schools public, locally elected officials, school boards in charge of their local schools, full funding. There is this movement from very right-wing folks mostly and some others who would give away taxpayer money to people to take to for-profit corporations and even faith-based institutions in violation of our Constitution. So we can't lose sight of the fact that that's happening in other states, and I'll work hard to keep our schools very public and locally accountable.
You mentioned cell phones in relation to mental health too. Classroom learning, behavior disruptions are concerns that you frequently hear from parents or teachers as reasons that they're concerned about their child's education. Do you have a plan to address classroom disruptions, to make education or classrooms more conducive to education, I guess?
Yeah, this has been building for decades across the country. It's not just now and it's not just the pandemic. So more than a plan, we've already issued guidance in the last several weeks to school districts to say we're going to change our rules at OSPI. We get some authority to create a better balance for how educators engage student discipline issues in the classroom. We still want parents very, very engaged. It's very important, but there's a normal relationship between a student and their peers and a student and an educator that has to be dealt with in the classroom. And I think our state and other states were getting a little too bureaucratic, where every single time a student was being addressed for behavior, it caused a mountain of paperwork, a mountain of phone calls, and it was bogging down the system. Instead of like when we went to school, if we were mouthing off in class or we weren't paying attention, the teacher got to address that right there. We're going to get back to that. And we're going to empower our educators with appropriate parent information, of course, along the way. But it's really important that all of us who have kids in schools remind them their job is to be respectful and to learn. That's their number one priority, respectful of all their educators and their peers. And we're going to lean into that pretty aggressively with our guidance here.
A number of school districts around the state have run into budget crises this year. And in terms of just the basic framework for education here, education funding, that is still an issue that's up for debate. People, there are policy advocates who are calling for an overhaul of the way that the state apportions money to different schools. Some think that the directing more resources to districts with higher cost of living leaves rural areas which may have a harder time passing bonds because the amount has to be higher, the percentage has to be higher if there's a smaller property base, and it sort of leaves them in the lurch in various ways. Do you think the state is on the right course and just needs to make adjustments, or should we overhaul our funding structure?
They need to make big investments because we fell behind after getting awfully close to the national average in terms of how much of our economy we put back in our schools. We got close in 2019, and then we've lost all that ground. And so we're 0.5% of our GDP behind. That doesn't sound like a lot. That's $4 billion a year. So it's more investment to close gaps, so students with disabilities and high poverty youth. And so our budget proposal, which will be out in 2 weeks, it addresses all of that. But there are still reasons to overhaul the model. The model is still written more than 20 years ago. It doesn't at all reflect the fact that we need more counselors and nurses and school psychs, which we've made great progress on, for example. But yeah, there's always room for the model to change, but let's not use that as an excuse not to invest today. Special education, transportation, these inflationary impacts on districts, we're leaning into that aggressively. It's the constitutional duty of the legislature. I expect they will step up to it this year. And then, you know, let's be super clear. Our legislature has made some good investments, and they've lowered dependence on levies. They used to be almost 30% of school budgets. They're down to 17% because the state's tried to fill that up. So there has been progress made. And the last thing I'll say, Mike, is there's over $1 billion a year that goes directly into high poverty communities through what we call the Learning Assistance Program, meals for kids, which under my leadership and partnership with legislators, we've doubled the number of kids getting breakfast and lunch. We target money for migrant youth and students who don't have English as their primary language. Our biggest gaps get more money right now, but there's a better way and a simpler way to do that. And I think that's what people are exploring. So I'm open to that completely. But not if people say, well, we explore it or study it for 4 years, let's do nothing in the meantime. I think we saw that in 2010 and 2011, and after the court ultimately came out, it took a long time for the legislature to invest because they said, let's study how to do it. We know what we have to do. So let's invest now while we're changing the model.
In general, do you think that districts have invested wisely in their workforce and their local education system with the funds that they've had, and in particular with one-time federal funding in recent years?
Well, we've been careful to tell districts along the way, this is one time, so don't create permanent commitments to it. And our districts did a fantastic job. We just did the model again. All 50 states are ranked on how efficiently they've spent their federal money. We're #1 in the nation. We will get through our federal money faster than everyone else. We're not asking for an extension. We have states that are still leaving 10, 15, 20% of their money on the table and asking for extensions from the feds. That's not Washington. We were very efficient. The challenge is it was used to backfill money that was taken from districts because of their enrollment decline. So now the state money's gone in many districts, and now the federal one-time money goes away. That's why districts are going to have to deal with some pretty tough things over the next year or two. What we say is, gosh, if they're still spending their local levies on special education and transportation and insurance costs and things that the state should pay for, then let's get the state to step up again, get back to the investment levels that were there before 2019, and we wouldn't be worrying about districts in distress today because the enrollment impacts have been so small that it isn't the biggest issue for them. It's losing money and then really losing money to inflation. And one-time federal money will not solve that long term.
Just on that same point, there's been some criticism that your office should have taken a more forceful role to make sure that districts weren't going to wind up in the red, basically, once the money ran out, the federal money. Is that fair?
No. Our guidance was very clear. Don't use this on permanent investments, this one-time money. Districts didn't. They did a good job. Our districts are suffering from inflation, a little bit of enrollment impact, 3.5% on average across the country or across the state. Our districts have done a fantastic job leaning into the most difficult time of our education history with the resources they have. They are starved of money in special ed and transportation and other programming areas. That is the biggest risk to them right now. They're still managing that. Out of 295 districts, 290 of them are managing their own business, and we're only intervening right now in 5 districts to try to get them on the right side of the balance, and only one needs significant intervention. So we guided them well. They did a good job. Everyone will want to deflect and sort of Monday morning quarterback what should have happened. Our districts use one-time money for one-time things, but they have permanent impacts to their state funds, and those have got to get backfilled now.
Let's transition to talk about testing and test scores in Washington. According to the Children's Alliance and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the 2024 Kids Count Data Book, the most recent student proficiency data show that 66% of 4th graders in Washington are not proficient in reading, 72% of 8th graders are not proficient in math, and overall Washington ranks 26th in the nation for education. So at the top of the bottom half of the list. What's your response to those numbers and your position on testing in general?
Well, unfortunately, the numbers are wrong. I really respect those organizations, but they use the word proficient that means something to us. The average person says proficient means they can't read, and that's not what that data means at all. So we've been really clear. We've worked with a national consortium. We're trying to get people to understand that we use a 1, 2, 3, 4 test score system in our state. 4 at the top, #1, students who are struggling. 2s, 3s, and 4s are high school proficient. They're high school equivalent, or they're grade equivalent. 3s and 4s are on their way to college without needing any remedial courses. People are getting that wrong, including my opponent. He keeps pointing to the students who get 3s and 4s and saying they're the only ones who are at grade level and everyone below that's not at grade level. That's not at all what it is. We've been trying to make this super clear. People intend to use this data this way, I think because they kind of want to nudge folks or harm public ed. I want to be really clear. It's 3/4 or more of students who are on grade level because 2s, 3s, and 4s are grade level. 3s and 4s are college ready, and those data are accurate to describe who's college and university ready. That's different than high school proficient. And so we're going to keep trying to clarify this. The other thing we always look at is relativity. So we're working hard. Math scores are recovering well. Reading scores are very flat. I acknowledge that, and we're trying to create interventions there. There's no question we've got to get back to where we were in reading. But there's only one national assessment that's common, the NAEP scores, National Assessment of Educational Progress. And there are only 2 states in America by 8th grade that outperform us in reading, and only 7 states that outperform us in mathematics by 8th grade. So we are a high-performing state. That doesn't mean we're ranked 3rd. I'm always clear about this. It means there are only 2 states statistically outperforming us in reading, and then there are a bunch of states that are very common after that because we have common national standards. And a 4th grader in Massachusetts should be at a reading level of a 4th grader in Washington or California or Texas. So it's not to say that those systems were meant to rank. It does tell you who's statistically outperforming you, and it's only 2 states in America in reading and only 7 states in America in mathematics. We're doing pretty damn well, but we got a lot of work to do.
So we are running low on time here, but if you could, as quickly as possible, anything we haven't addressed that you want to bring up or anything you wanted to add?
Well, this is a campaign episode, and I always love coming onto your show. Normally, I'm wearing my superintendent hat, but I'm running for re-election. You've got my opponent who will be with you as well, and I always think we never get to some other issues that matter a ton, which isn't just our policy values and all that. It's experience. I'm a former classroom teacher. Heck, I was a custodian, a summer custodian in schools at one point in my time. Served on a school board, worked in higher education for 14 years, served in the legislature. Experience matters. I've been a CFO of a multi-billion-dollar organization. I am today the leader of our system that needs work and intervention and progress. But experience matters, and I believe I'm the only one who has that. I believe my opponent does not have the experience to do this job well, and I deeply respect his military background. That's very different than being trained as an educator.
We will have to leave it there. Thank you very much again, Chris Reykdal. We do appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Still ahead, hear from the other candidate running for the office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. David Olson joins us next. Stay with us.
The future of space exploration.
I think there's a lot of opportunity that we don't even know exists.
Earlier, we spoke with the incumbent candidate running for the office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. Now, we'll hear from the person running to unseat him. Joining me now is OSPI candidate David Olson. Thank you very much for your time today. If you could please, just if elected, give us your top priorities for public education in Washington and any challenges that you intend to address.
I think the absolute #1 priority is to advocate that the state legislature meet their constitutional duty of fully funding basic ed, specifically special education funding. That would be my absolute #1 priority. Teachers are absolutely overwhelmed in the classroom. They don't have enough paraeducator support, especially for their special services, special needs kids. And so the state is not meeting their duty to fully fund, especially special ed, but basic ed in general. I want to make sure that we maintain academic rigor so that our students are challenged in their curriculum. And I believe that over the past 8 years, our public education system has started to be dumbed down, and parents are complaining to me that the reason they're pulling their kids out of school is they don't believe their kids are getting enough academic rigor to prepare them for post-secondary, whether it be four-year college or trades or military or whatever. So those are certainly 2 critical areas that I think we need to focus on. And 3, I think we do need to do more to support students that are struggling, especially in high poverty and some of the more districts that are have more of a BIPOC community, people of color, and so rural and high poverty school district areas that those kids are struggling. So I'd like to see us do more to give those students additional supports to help lift them up. so they can achieve academically.
On the thread of academic achievement, the Children's Alliance and the Annie E. Casey Foundation reports that based on the most recent data, 66% of fourth graders in Washington are not proficient in reading, 72% of eighth graders not proficient in math, and that overall Washington ranks 26th in the nation for education. Your opponent says that's not actually the case. Those figures are not really accurate, sort of represent a lack of understanding about the grading system or the evaluation scale in place. What's your take?
Well, during one of our candidate forums before the primary, both myself and the previous candidate, Reed Sars, both of us criticized him, as did the Seattle Times, that under his leadership, we've gone from number 8 in the nation as a public education system to number 27. So I agree with that data. I think that he's trying to pull a rabbit out of a hat. I'm not sure where he's pulling his numbers, but using the OSPI data and the NEAP data that you referenced, we are absolutely going in the wrong direction. Even if you looked at OSPI data from 22-23, less than half our kids in the state, around 50% of the kids in our state can read at grade level, and about a third can pass their math and science. And so I'm not the only person that agrees that that's correct, and I believe that Chris Reykdal is hiding the numbers, if you will.
Do you have a strategy to improve test scores specifically?
I think when I taught the teachers around the state, they tell me that there's several issues that impact their classroom. One is student discipline. Cell phones is another one, and absenteeism. And so being able to address those issues and find the root causes of what those are, I think would help, because the teachers tell me they're overwhelmed. First, the highest priority is student discipline, trying to be able to get a child that's acting out under control. Oftentimes they have to, based on current rules, they have to take an entire class out and leave the unruly student in the class. And I think that's unfair to the teacher and the rest of the class. Teachers tell me that they've wanted to leave the profession because they can't get their students off their cell phones. And when they ask them to get off the phone, the student will say, "Make me." So a year ago, my school district passed a resolution eliminating cell phones in our schools and banning social media. So that had a really positive impact. And then the teachers are not getting the paraeducator support that they need to help take the onus off. So when you have a third of your students are special needs students and the rest are gen ed, and you have to focus more of your time on the special needs, you tend to put the rest of the students on a digital device and teach digitally versus developing a relationship with the kids like you and I probably had when we were in school.
If we could go back to the funding issue for a second, in terms of ways to maximize the benefit of the available funds out there, only so many funds to go around. Do you think that, are schools and districts making the best decisions with the funding from your perspective?
I believe many of them are not. And I think part of the fact is that OSPI, under the current leadership, does not do enough to educate the schools and the school boards on how best to utilize their funds. They'll push the money out, give them their monthly apportionment, but oftentimes schools don't have enough education on how best to spend that money. I've taught the school superintendents around the state, and they say that transportation funding is critically underfunded the way the model is, and the special ed. So most of the superintendents tell me that we can just get the special ed funding and transportation under control. It would really go a long way. My school district did not fall victim to the funding crisis that many of the school districts are going through right now. I have a public finance background. We have an amazing CFO. Our school board asks tough questions, and we have monthly budget updates, what many school boards don't. They put their finance documents into a consent agenda, and just any questions that approve the consent agenda without actually doing a deep dive into the budget. And I think that's to their detriment that they don't do that. So as superintendent, I would encourage school boards to take public finance training so they understand how to read a basic public finance document. And I would encourage them to have monthly finance updates from their CFO or budget manager like we do in mine. And we also put our entire budget online for review, so we're not hiding anything. And so I think that, I don't think it's intentional that they're not spending it correct. I just think they could use some guidance from OSPI on how best to utilize that funds.
Just to focus on school construction funding for a second, the way the state constitution is written, that school, basic education funding comes from one pot of money, and then school construction is something else. And the way the state legislature appropriates money requires a local bond initiative to pass, but that is difficult, particularly for the districts with the smaller property bases, the rural ones, the ones that typically or may have some of the oldest buildings or need the most upgrades, and they're in the least able to afford those repairs. Do you have a straightforward solution to that, or do you think that's going to require a constitutional amendment?
I'd like to see the state do more to fix the capital fund issue. I think especially rural school districts are not getting enough from the state to help them, the ones that have trouble passing those capital bonds. Even the ones that do pass capital bonds, it's really onerous process to go through the various steps to get all that funding in order, and then to get SCAP funding, and then to be able to use other things that you get from building a new school. So if you're building a new school to reduce overcrowding, you can get extra money from the state to reduce overcrowding. Plus you can get impact fees that when someone buys a house or builds a new home, they have to pay impact fees for that. And schools can use that money to buy portables and things like that. But the way that schools are funded right now, the per square foot is really, really high. So your home that you live in might, if you went to sell it, might sell for $400 a square foot, but a school might cost $900 a square foot. So it's really, really challenging to get some of these bonds passed because of that. Under the current superintendent, he's used his bully pulpit on the Department of Natural Resources Board to discontinue some old growth forest harvesting, and the revenue from that timber harvest goes to school construction, especially rural schools. So, taking that funding off the table from our rural schools, I think is a negative impact them. Consider that we don't fully fund schools now. For him to advocate for taking that timber sales off the table for those schools, I think is doing them a disservice.
So we're running just a little over a minute left here, and I want to get to two more things that give you a chance to close us out here. But so you mentioned the Seattle Times had criticized your opponent related to some of the test scores, policy, that sort of thing. I believe you also were criticized for some remarks you made about four-year universities during a convention. Do you care to clarify anything that you said, or do you stand by those remarks?
What I said was that I was in the military for 28 years. I was a Navy electrician, I was a Navy diver, and underwater welder. Those are all skilled trade, blue-collar jobs. And I'm very supportive of the skilled trades and making sure that we give our students additional pathways other than a four-year university. I think they should have the opportunity to go to four-year if they want, skilled trades, technical, or in the military like I did. So I was joking when that happened and said, hey, if all the kids go to trade school and get a skilled trades degree and all the schools, four-year universities go bankrupt, I'd be fine with that. I was joking. I said I was being facetious. I have a four-year degree. My wife's a school teacher. My son's a school teacher. And 3 of my 4 kids have college degrees. My oldest son is in the skilled trades. So I told the Seattle Times I was joking, but they chose not to accept that explanation.
We're running very low on time. If you could, though, as briefly as possible, anything I didn't get to, anything you want to add? Closing remarks.
I just think that I make an analogy whenever I have a debate or with the Seattle Times or whoever. In professional sports, if a team is losing repeatedly year over year, they fire the head coach. Earlier this year, the Seattle Kraken fired their coach after one bad season. In my opinion, under the current leadership, we've had 8 failed seasons, going from number 8 in the nation, number 27 in the nation academically. And I think it's time that the people of Washington fire the coach and bring in someone new, and I hope that they'll choose me.
We're out of time. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you again very much, David Olson. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for watching. Please join us next week for more in-depth interviews you won't find anywhere else. I'm Mike McClanahan. Have a great week.